Let's add the fall damage to our first-person controller. To work on the fall damage, I'm going to make use of the Newton's first law. In Newton's first law, there is an equation, F equals ma. In this equation, it states that the force experienced by an object is equal to the mass of an object multiplied by the acceleration, which is the change in velocity divided by the change of time. So what are we going to do with this force? I'm going to make use of the on-collision enter method of the monobehavior class to listen to the collision enter event. When the collider of the player hits something, it will calculate the impact force. And based on the value of the impact force, we will define a threshold. If the impact force exceeds that threshold, then it will trigger the fall damage. Let's open up our player controller script. And in the runtime section, I'm going to define a new float variable called vyCache. This value will store the vertical velocity of the player in each frame, and it is used for the calculation of the impact force. In the fixed update method, I'm going to add a new line, and I will set vyCache to be the instantaneous velocity of the player in the y direction. And let's scroll to the bottom of the script, and here we will define a new method called the on-collision enter method. This method again takes a collision parameter. Inside this method, I will define a new float variable called the acceleration. And I will give it a value of the instantaneous velocity of the rigid body in the y direction minus the vyCache. And let's add a parenthesis to this one and divide it by time.fixed delta time. The first part inside the parentheses calculates the difference in the velocity. And time.fixed delta time is simply the time difference. Then I will define another float variable called the impact force. And this simply equals to the mass of the rigid body multiplied by the acceleration value, which we just calculated. Let's go back to the configurations section. Here I will define a new float variable called the impact threshold. And now we will go back to the on-collision enter method. If the impact force calculated is greater than or equal to the impact threshold, then we will trigger the fall damage. Let's save the script, go back to the editor, let's click on the player object, and I will define an impact threshold. I'll give a value of 200. Now let's run the game. I'll first set the player's rigid body to be kinematic and raise the position, and disabling its kinematic, the player will fall down. And you can see as the player hits the ground, it triggers the fall damage because the impact force is greater than the threshold. Let's do a little bit of modification to the code. For the impact force, I'm going to make the acceleration an absolute value using the mathf.absolute method. This ensures the impact force is always positive. We also need to consider another scenario. If the player is constantly falling, we don't want to trigger the fall damage if the player hits a vertical wall. So in the beginning of the onCollision enter method, I will add the following lines of code. We will use the vector3.dot method to calculate the dot product between the first contact point of the collision and the vector3.up direction. So here we will write collision.getContact, and 0 stands for the first contact point, dot normal, and vector3.up. If the value returned is smaller than 0.5, and if the velocity of the player in the y direction is smaller than -5, we will simply set the velocity of the player to be vector3.up multiplied by its vertical velocity. This eliminates the player's velocity in the x and the z direction and allows the player to continue falling downwards. After this line, I will make use of the return keyword to skip the code below. So let's save the script and go back to the editor. So back to the editor, I've rotated the ground to 80 degrees to the horizontal. I've added a few lines of debug code which will always calculate and output the impact force. For the player object, the impact threshold remains at 200 newtons. Let's run the game and see if it triggers the fall damage. As you can see, the impact force is over 5,000 newtons, which is way above the impact threshold. But this did not trigger the fall damage because the conditions are not met. And you can see the player is now falling along the ground instead of receiving fall damage. So we've completed the fall damage. In the next episode, we will work on the camera effects. I'm Yellow Flicker, and I will see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.